Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Matt Ledbetter. We're back with the House of Folk Art, and we have a very special guest, somebody that has been in the folk art game for a long time. He was there at the Lowe Collection. This is Brian Sieveking. So I've known Brian for, 5 years now.
Probably.
One of the special appearances Brian made was when we sold to Sam Doyle.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
That was when you came before the auction.
Yeah, that was the Mullers, yeah.
Yep. And it was like, holy cow, this must be good if Brian's coming to check it out in person before the auction. And then we go on to find out that you went to the Lowe auction, right?
Oh, yeah, years ago. Yeah, down in Atlanta.
Yeah, like 96.
Yeah, when Kimball Sterling and Slotin were sort of fighting it out.
Like 1996, the Lowe Collection is passed over to Kimball. How many Sam Doyles were there? Do you remember?
I don't remember the exact amount, but it was more than I'd ever seen in one place. And I'd always wanted a Sam Doyle, and I was convinced that was my opportunity. And so I had saved and saved. I didn't have a lot of money then, and I had $6,000, which was a huge amount of money for me,
Right.
at that time.
So 96, how old were you?
How old was I in 96? I was early 30s.
Right.
And I went down there, and I'd strategized, I'd looked at them, and I thought, well, this one's going to go for, 7,000, and this one's going to go for 8,000. I had price checked things,
Right.
I had this whole sort of bidding strategy worked out, what I was going to start low on and what I was going to jump in on at just the right point, and how I was going to intimidate people by bumping the bid. And I mean, the first one of those things came up, and it just went, let's start this at 500. And I was like, great. And then it just went 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000. I mean, none of them went for close to the amount of money I had. I mean, the prices of all the Sam Doyles effectively doubled during that auction, and I was just sort of sitting there crestfallen.
Wow.
And
so there was a traveling museum, right, that the Lowes had that was called Baking in the Sun, right?
Well, there was a big one of the first big sort of contemporary outsider shows that had major, sort of distribution and went a lot of places and it had a book that went along with it called Baking in the Sun.
And then is all of that in the book, though? Is all of that from the Lowe Collection?
I believe so.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that collection that tour was actually just before I started being interested and started collecting.
Right.
I mean, I may have been in high school when that tour went on.
And so the Lowes, they purchased these directly from Sam Doyle.
As far as I know, they bought all of their stuff directly from the artists.
Man, well, I bet if they were, are they still alive? Probably not. I mean,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
If they're still alive and they ever went to Sam Doyle's house and left anything unbought, I bet they are just like, oh man, we should have bought everything.
From what I know of their collection and from what I saw over the years in shows and in auctions, I don't think they were people who left much unbought when they decided on acquiring.
Just to take the context, when's the last time a Sam Doyle's been sold? I mean, one a year. If we go a year without
seeing nearly as I mean, there were never huge amounts of Sam Doyles.
Right.
I mean, you would see an auction. I mean, the Kimball auction was a real.
That's what we're saying. I mean, I think they had 17, 12 or 17.
Maybe.
I mean, it was more than 10.
Yeah, that's the most I've ever seen at an auction.
And now you go a year and you don't even see one come to public auction.
Even 5 years ago, if there were 2 Sam Doyles in an auction, it was a lot of Sam Doyles in an auction. Maybe 3.
Man, that's crazy. So who was buying them? Was the same person? Could you tell? I mean, was the same person buying them? Or
there were plenty of people. I mean, outsider art had really taken off. There were a lot of people at that auction, and there were people on the phones. You know, and that was it was done in conjunction, well, I shouldn't say in conjunction, it was done in competition
Right.
with Folk Fest.
Right.
And so there were hundreds of people at Folk Fest, and
So tell me, let's talk about Folk Fest a little bit. All right, so you got Atlanta. It's a weekend in Atlanta, and it's an outdoor festival, right?
oh, it was indoor.
It was an
It was
indoor.
in
Oh,
an exhibition center.
I never pictured Folk Fest was indoor.
Yeah.
I
it was
never pictured this indoor out of all the conversations I've had.
Yeah, it was about I would say it was maybe 10 or 12 miles north of Atlanta in an exhibition center that was out there.
Right. So when you walked in, was it dealer for the very first? It was dealers. It
Yeah.
wasn't artists.
There were I'm trying to remember if Howard was at I don't think Howard was at the first one. Howard was at, like, the third one, I think, but, there were a couple of artists who had been brought by dealers,
Right.
and I know that maybe it was the second year, like, the Folk Arts Center up in Moorhead, Kentucky brought some artists down. Raymond
Okay.
Cooper was there and some Ronald Cooper, excuse me, and some people.
So like right now you go to the Hickory Pottery Festival. It's all artists. And then it's out of 200 vendors, there's probably 5 dealers.
Yeah, this would have been the opposite of that.
Yeah, so when it started, it was dealers. So there's no telling what you would find at Folk Fest. It
Oh.
just depends on the dealer. I mean, you could find the best of the best.
Oh, yeah, there was that first one, there was great stuff there.
What year was the very first Folk Fest, remember?
I was afraid you were gonna ask me
It was
that.
before 96.
It was I'm in my head, I have it as 93, but I would
Right.
have to check that.
So in a short period of time, because I remember in 1998, so if it started, just say it's 93. So in less than 5 years, Kimball had the Folky Showy. That was what he called his, the very same week, the days.
Yeah, yeah.
And
yeah.
then Benny Carter and Ron Causey did one, and they called it Atlanta 98. So within 5 years, you don't have just one venue. Now you have 3
Oh, yeah,
that's
yeah.
popped up. That's pretty exciting. And then today, they're all it's done. They don't do it anymore, right?
Oh, yeah, they stopped.
Yeah,
a
but
while
New
back.
York still does the Outsider Art
Art
Fair.
Fair, and that preceded all of those. I mean,
Right.
that Outsider Art Fair has been going on for
Yeah.
a while.
Well, I remember Steve telling me the very first Folk Fest, they went up there and they were handing out flyers inside. And then they basically told them, like, look, you guys can't do that.
Oh, yeah.
You can't come
Yeah,
in here
you can't.
and hand out flyers for your show in Atlanta. So
Yeah.
I thought that was funny. But I mean, what a go-getter. So man, I mean, to be in that, because I mean, I know we got a lot of viewers that are younger than me probably, especially on the Tiki-Taki, but I just didn't know anything about Folk Fest back
Yeah.
in 93. I mean, shoot, I was 14 or 15 years old. So being embedded in this industry like I am now, it's like folk stories when people
yeah.
talk about Folk Fest. It's so cool to hear. And then the auctions that were ran by Kimball. And does anything jump out in your head about Folk Fest when you walked in, the opportunity to buy something that you never thought?
I mean, there are a few things, but the one that just haunts me is when you first walked in one of the big galleries, and I can't remember exactly who it was, but one of the big galleries was set up pretty front and center when you were going down the first aisle, and they had a Sam Doyle King Kong painting. It was a small painting, and it was just the profile, and I looked at that thing, and I was just like, "Oh," and it wasn't terribly expensive for a Sam Doyle and for a Sam Doyle of that time, and I talked myself out of buying it, and I mean, driving back home afterwards, about the time I hit Gaffney, I was like, "Oh, I should have bought that
I gotta
thing."
turn
Like, I
around.
can't and the last time I saw it, when they first started lifting the COVID restrictions, I went down to, the South Carolina, the museum in Columbia because they had a big show of face jugs that they had put up, and they had their permanent collection up, and that painting was sitting in the permanent collection.
Oh,
I
man.
was like,
So
"Yep, you aren't getting that. That
so-
one's not gonna reappear."
So Ron was right when he said, it's not the art that you buy that you regret. It's the art that you don't buy that you regret? I mean, you said it, and it's haunting me that you didn't get this piece. I mean, I'm gonna think about
Oh, I
this
can tell
tonight.
you a story that's the first time I went to Paradise Gardens, I started collecting because when I was in college, uh, Howard came and did one of his workouts my first semester.
So tell them what a workout is.
Okay, so Howard did I don't know exactly how many of these he did, but he did several, and he would go to a college, and he called it a workout, and he would be there usually for about a week, and he brought all of his dimensions up, which is what he called his stencils that he made his artwork from,
Right.
and, I mean, they would lay them all out on the floor, and, I mean, there were hundreds
What year was
of
this?
these. This was 1985.
1985. Got it.
1985. It was done. There was a professor at Virginia Tech where I was going to school named Ray Cass, who set up this program called the Mountain Lake Symposium that was phenomenal. He would bring artists in to work with the students. And I mean, he brought in people from Wayne Thiebaud to John Cage. I mean, very, very, the highest of conceptual art.
Upper
And
echelon.
yeah, and he brought Howard in. And I had no idea who this guy was.
Right.
I just saw this funky painting that had a UFO in it and went, well, that seems kind of funny. I'll go look at that. And I just was fascinated. I mean, I was all in. I mean, I was fascinated by Howard. And when he was done, I was the only person who wanted to drive him back. Howard didn't fly. Plus, well, you could fly from Atlanta to Roanoke, and then go to Blacksburg, so it wouldn't have been that big a deal, but Howard didn't like flying, so I was the only person who wanted to drive him back to Somerville, and it
Right.
was
From Virginia Tech
yeah,
to Somerville, Georgia.
right about 7 hours, and
One way?
one way, yeah.
So you were in the car for 7 hours with Howard Finster.
Oh, over the years, I did more than 7 hours at times, but yeah, and he talked the entire 7 hours, and I was just wrapped. I mean, it was
So we're gonna
incredible.
co-write a book, and it's gonna be called 7 Hours with Howard Finster. Dude,
I drove him from Somerville to Charlottesville for the Virginia Film Festival, and that was like 10 hours or 11 hours.
wow. Dude, so
Yeah.
when I tell you guys, I told you guys, when I tell you we're here with a legend, he doesn't know that he's a legend.
Howard
When-
was a legend.
When I tell you that we're here with a legend in the folk art, third-party industry, on the buyer side, we are talking to a legend today. I mean, this is incredible. So what did he do in the car ride home? What did he talk about?
He mainly talked about his life, and I mean, it was great. It was, Howard at that time, I think he maybe slept 3 hours a night, maybe 3 hours a night, and
Right.
he would eat coffee, freeze-dried coffee out of the jar, and he was just I mean, I was 18, 19 years old, and I would go down to visit him, and I couldn't stay up. I couldn't keep up with him. I mean, there would come a point where you would just go, "Okay, I have to go sleep now."
Right.
And he would still be painting and would just
Well, no wonder he
continue
did
painting.
47,000
Yeah, I mean,
pieces. Jeez.
but he talked to me the best part was he would talk about he talked about his whole life, and there were, you know, very, very deep I mean, he talked to me once about how hard it was to be a minister during the Depression because his congregation were all just dirt poor. I mean, and talking about burying people close to Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the cheap part of the cemetery down by the river where you would have to cut the eulogy short because the grave would start to fill up with water
Ooh.
while you were delivering the eulogy, and having people who didn't have anything ask him to explain why God had let their kid die. And I mean, so it went everywhere from that to talking about,
Wow.
visions of new space, vehicles that he wished he could talk to the government about because he had an idea about them.
Wow.
And it was just extraordinary. I mean, and then I got down there and saw that environment that he had built and I was gone by that point. And of course, Howard was sort of the center of the folk art world then, and he laid all the books that people sent him out, and he had all other artists, pictures of their work. Some of them had sent him work to hang, and he would put their addresses up,
Oh, wow.
and so, but what I was starting to say was, you talk about things you regret. He took me into a room, and there must have been 30 pieces in there, some of which were large scale paintings, and he said, "I'll sell you this whole room for $1,000."
What was the date of this?
This is 1985. It
Oh
would
my
have
God.
been, probably May, and I didn't have $1,000,
Right.
all right, and now I think, well, I had a credit card in my pocket but my parents had raised me in such a way that you didn't go to the bank and get it.
Right.
And I bought 2 of the pieces, I had like $150 with me or
Yeah.
something.
How many pieces was it?
I
Full
think
room.
it was I would bet there were 30 pieces in there.
Wow.
But here's the thing, in the long run, I think if I had had $1,000 and had given him $1,000 and carried those things out and put them in my car, I would have had a very different relationship with him than I had.
Right.
Because I think I would have been a dealer then in his
Right.
mind, and instead, I would go down and just I probably visited him over about a 10-year period, probably 25 times.
Wow.
I went down there, and it was just a wonderful relationship that I had with him.
Yeah.
And I think if I had bought that room, it would have been a different.
He would have put you in a different category.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I don't know any living artist that has not fallen out with a dealer. Like
Yeah.
fallen out. I mean, they all do. And they paint about
I've
it.
fallen out with dealers. So
Well, we'll talk about that. That sounds very interesting. I've fallen out with I don't fall out with anybody. So, dude, I'm mesmerized by this. I mean, this is who else in the United States? I mean, there's got to be 10 people or less that
Oh, no,
that's visited.
there's lots of people. I mean, and the thing is, like,
When you say lots though that are still alive, I mean, there's not lots. There's not 500 people that went to Howard 25 times in a 10-year
well,
period.
that's probably true. But
Yeah,
you would
I
be
mean,
surprised. There were any number of people who regularly visited Howard.
for sure.
And I got very lucky because I met other people who were frankly much more important people who did a lot more work than I did. But I met the people at the Jargon Society in Winston-Salem, Tom Patterson and Jonathan Williams, who'd been visiting and recording people, and Roger Manley, who used to be the director of the Greg. I think he's retired down, at NC State. And they knew everybody. And Roger Manley, I met him through Ray Cass. You could call him up and say, I want to go down and see Jimmy Lee Sudduth. And he would tell you exactly how to get to, and this is before cell phones. This is before Google Maps. He would say, we'll take this interstate and then get off on this secondary road and then get off on this tertiary road and then turn left at the post office. And then he would also say, oh yeah, and if you're going down there, you want to see Fred Webster, and this is where he lives, and you want to see B.F. Perkins. And
Is he still alive?
He's still living, yeah.
Yeah.
And he took phenomenal photographs of.
Right. So document. When you said they did them all, you mean they documented?
Oh, absolutely.
Documented.
Interviewed, photographed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
And North Carolina was sort of a center of that.
I don't think, but here's the whole holdup with outsider art, self-taught art, visionary art. I don't think people understand that so much documentation was going on even 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
And that's why somebody told me the other day that they read in a magazine that outsider art, since Christie's just did their outsider art specialty auction, and they've done that before for years. I think they were doing it a long time ago, but the art magazine said outsider art is the new it in the art world. But for some people, it's been it for 30 years.
And frankly, in the art world, I would say, I mean, it's hard for me to realize that I've been doing this now for 40 years, but
right.
It seems like about every 5 or 6 years, there's an article about how outsider art is it now.
Right.
That's been the case since before I started But there were people, I mean, Roddy Moore, who ran
know
the
Roddy.
Blue Ridge Institute at Faro, you know, he
Faro.
wrote a book on outsider artists,
What's that called?
like, I can't, it was like contemporary folk art. I don't think he used the term outsider art.
Right.
But they wrote that book, I think, in the late 70s. I mean, they dealt with Creek Charlie Fields down in Lebanon, Virginia, and Dow Pugh over in
Cedar Creek.
Tennessee.
You talking about Cedar Creek,
yeah,
Charlie? Yeah. Wow.
And,
Let's talk about Cedar Creek, Charlie for a second, because I have a funny story about that. So when we took a collection because the guy basically got told, listen, you got 5 days to move out of the house you're in. And he's like, I can't take it all, because he rented. And he's like, I can't take it all. And the judge said, take what you need. So he got us involved, and we brought a Freightliner down, and we basically took the whole house. So against the wall, leaning against the wall, there were 5 boards, and they were painted, and they were in succession, and I left them, and they stayed there all day. And at the end, we were about to leave. He said, you didn't grab the Cedar Creek Charlie wall. And I go, what the hell are you talking about? And that's when I got exposed. Then I Googled it, and you see the house that Cedar Creek Charlie painted. This was part of the house. This was 5 boards from the house that I was about to leave.
Yeah.
And
you know, Charlie, I mean, every time I meet someone who grew up down around there, down in, you know, far southwestern Virginia, a lot of people who were, you know, whose parents were coal miners or grandparents were coal miners, I always ask them if they have old family photographs, because an awful lot of families down there used to drive to his house and have family portraits taken.
oh, that's
Because
awesome.
the exterior of the house changed regularly. I mean, he would completely repaint the interior and the exterior
Oh, that's
continuously.
That's awesome.
And there's, like, apparently, and these are all stories I've heard, but there was a hive of bees, a huge community of bees that lived in that house, that he lived with in the house.
Wow.
And when he died, they all just left. So like this massive swarm of bees just disappeared from the house.
So and you'll actually be teaching me, where did he come from? What began? I mean, what happened? What's the
As far as I
story?
know, I mean, I never met him. I mean, but
what years are we talking?
I would have to look that up. I mean, it's
Google
died.
Cedar Creek Charlie and see if there's a born and birthday.
Yeah, but he you know, he lived in that house for decades.
So is that all he did, was paint the inside and outside of his house? He never painted on plywood?
He painted the interior as well.
Right.
There's a big exhibition of his work in a museum outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. It's part, you know, I think the state runs it, and it's a large museum, and they have a lot of older buildings, log cabins and things, and they have a really nice selection of his work in there. But he painted all the objects in his house. He painted rugs, he painted
So when you
toys,
say his work, when you say a selection of his work, you mean the objects in his house?
Absolutely.
Yeah, like maybe a table that he painted with something on top of it. Gotcha.
Yeah.
But he wasn't like, and this is,
he wasn't out in the yard painting tableaus.
Or like pieces of tin. You're not going to find that.
I think there's a little bit of that, but he just obsessively, compulsively made art on everything that was around him. He was sort of like, there was a guy, you know, who his name just flew out of Lemmings, who lived close to Howard, who they called the Electric Man because he gave himself electric shock. And
I don't know about this guy.
And he did red, white, and blue paintings.
Gotcha.
And you would go to see him, and he would always just have everything in his yard. Like if he had a washing machine that went bad, he would paint it red, white, and blue. You know, they were these really pretty sophisticated. If you hung them in the Hirshhorn, people would assume they were modernist art from Paris in the 30s, and they were just these hard-edged, abstract red, white, and blue paintings. And it was just a compulsion. These guys painted continuously and painted everything, and anything that was around them was a suitable painting surface.
Right. Even a washer.
Right.
that went bad.
Yeah.
That's what's up. Well, hey, and it's called, isn't it called art without intention? I
Yes.
mean, you know, they don't know that
Which
they're
is also
creating a collectible.
what you also call the highest level of modern art. You know,
Right.
their whole thing was, we wanna make art without intention, unintentional art.
It's actually, it's hard. I can never make unintentional art. I don't even think you could.
It's a very
because
difficult thing to do.
you see it so much.
Yeah, it's something that happens if you're a painter, it happens occasionally where you just start working automatically, but it's a very rare sort of uh, workspace to enter,
No.
you know?
And that's why it's so special when you find that one, like Cedar Creek Charlie, who when he started painting the circles all over his house, he didn't ever think that these planks are gonna be worth something
No,
one
no,
day.
not at
I mean,
all.
he
He
was
never
just feeling a void.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
never something, I'm sure that was not something that was in his head for his
Right.
entire life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Cedar Creek Charlie is a name that if you're just now jumping into collecting self-taught art, you probably don't even know who this guy is, but put him on your piece of paper. And I don't think, when's the last time you've seen, I think, so we sold the planks. I think there was 4 of them. We sold those like 3 years ago, but before then, when's the last time you saw?
Kimball Sterling, who had an auction house in Johnson City, Tennessee. He had a bunch of the interior pieces in an auction, I'm gonna say in the mid-90s.
Right. And that was probably from Howard Smith. Did you know?
I met Howard Smith twice,
Nice.
and, I can't claim to really have known Howard Smith. He passed away just when I was in a position where I was going, he rather tragically passed away very unexpectedly.
Yeah.
I think during a visit to his doctor.
He did.
And, but I had just met him, and he had invited me to come down and look at the warehouses and stuff, and then he passed away, so.
Wow. So did you ever get a hot dog with him?
No, but tell me the hot dog story, and I'll tell you my eating with Howard Smith story.
Okay, I never knew Howard Smith, but this is how I know Howard Smith. Howard wrote the Index of Southern Potters,
Yeah.
right? And that book was written in 1987. There was no internet. You could not type in North Carolina potters and get the list who copy it and make a book, right?
Yeah.
So he had to travel to do this. And this was an encyclopedia of potters, first name, last name. Most of the times they had their, I mean, it was incredible. It was an incredible feat. He wrote that book. When he gave it to my dad, because he knew my dad. My dad was a picker since the 70s and bought and sold to and from Howard. When Howard gave my dad the copy of that book, he signed it to Wade, King of the Pickers. So in my house, dude, it is a shrine. Like, that book is worn out. The spine's coming out because whenever the internet wasn't around. And I remember I was born in 82. So 1995, I was 13, 14. I knew what money was. When we picked a piece of pottery that was stamped AC,
Yeah.
we're like, what is AC? Well, I don't know. Go to the C's in the Index of Southern Potters. There was no internet. Boom. Anderson Craven, born 1780, father of blah. I mean, it was right there.
Yeah.
And so I consistently looked in that book, and I consistently saw to Wade, King of the Pickers. And I'm like, dang, I didn't really understand who Howard Smith was at that time. All right, fast forward, I get into this. Kimball Sterling did Howard Smith's auction, who Ron knew Howard, and Ron was kind of like my confidant in this. And so he told me all the stories. So back to your question, one of the stories he says, so him and Howard are going to visit 2 or 3 potters in Georgia. So they're driving to Georgia, and they've been driving for hours. And all of a sudden, and there was no GPS back then. So all of a sudden, Howard tells Ron, turn right, right here. Boom, Ron turns right. About 5 minutes later, Ron's like, Howard, what are we doing? we're supposed to be going that way. He's like, oh, I heard about a hot dog joint down here. I want to go try them out. And Ron was like, he just loved hot dogs. I mean, he would, but I think it's what killed him. I
That's
mean,
possible.
dude,
I went to lunch with him once at a sushi place in the Roanoke City market. It had just opened, and this was when sushi was first sort of arriving. And I'll never forget sitting down with him and that, we brought this was legitimate sushi and we brought it out and, he saw that green ball
oh,
on the
the
plate, the
wasabi.
wasabi, and this guy had real wasabi.
Right,
This wasn't grocery store wasabi.
right.
And Howard goes, "What's this?" And, I wasn't some culinary expert or anything, but I said, that's wasabi. It's pretty hot." And Howard did that. Well, I know hot, and he popped that whole ball in his mouth
What did
and
I?
almost died there. I mean, no, I mean,
Yeah.
his face turned bright red and sweat was pouring down his face. And I
Oh
was
my
like,
gosh.
yeah, there's real wasabi and then there's the other kind.
So
But he was, he's an incredibly important person. I mean, the work that he did on southeastern pottery is extraordinary.
that and the self-taught art. I
Yeah,
mean, he was. So my dad being in the antique business, when you're picking, you're door knocking, you're looking for the older pottery. You're not even at this point, you're not even looking for Berlin Craig, because if you wanna buy Berlin Craig, you just go see Berlin Craig, right?
Yeah.
So you're not looking for Billy Ray Hussey. No. You're riding by houses saying, "No, they're not old enough. They ain't got nothing. They ain't got" boom, right there, old farmhouse. There's the old home place house in the back. Let's get in the basement. Let's get the
Yeah.
hump board. Let's get the corner cupboard, this and that. He had no respect for the Richard Burnsides that Howard knew about, or the Benny Carter. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
Howard was well informed about Benny Carter, so it was hard for an antique dealer to shift over. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah. Oh, and
the
that's there's still a little bit of that. But when I first started being involved, which was the mid-80s, that was sort of the height of this sort of battle between people traditional folk art and outsider art, and
right,
there were real intense fights over that at galleries, at museums, at art centers, and there's still a tiny bit of it, but it's not nearly as pronounced as it was, but I knew people who just, get that Howard Finster well, Howard was sort of different because he fits into traditional folk art in a way,
right.
but yeah, if you showed somebody
That's not
you
art.
know,
That
Richard Burnside is the perfect example, or James Harold Jennings, or, they would just go, that's not folk art. And technically, there was a technical government definition of folk art,
right,
which was this is a multi-generational art that's been passed down and it has an economic impact on a community that can be demonstrated. And so technically it wasn't folk art.
right.
But eventually, the traditional folk art people, especially at institutions, realized that there was a huge audience for this stuff that would help bring traffic, and so that sort of lessened their antipathy for it, I think.
So if you don't want to start a debate, you just call it whatever you want, folk art, this and that. But for a debating purposes, you're right. It's not folk art.
Yeah,
And that's where the terms self-taught, I mean, hands down, all day, you cannot argue, nobody could, that Richard Burnside was not a self-taught artist.
yeah,
And when that term comes out, and people say, "Well, it's art. Why do we gotta classify it?" You classify it because people are trying to buy it, and they wanna know what they're buying. And when people walk in their house and say, "What is that? I could do that." Well, that's a piece of self-taught art. That's by Richard Burnside. He was a crackhead that lived in Myrtle Beach, and, we're lucky to have anything because he smoked crack all the time. So he was either in a crack house or living with Ron Causey, or he was in, well the House of Blues.
yeah,
They said
yeah.
when he went into the House of Blues, they would put down, I guess back then they had paper, white paper, and he would sit there and he would draw all over the white paper, and the waitresses and the waiters would fight to
To
be
get
his because at the end of it, they would keep the paper. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah, and there were,
So
there were a number of people like that. There were artists where people would say, "Well, you need to go to Tidewater and go to the Hardys." And you'd go into the Hardys, and there would be a guy sitting there with, magic markers and a drawing pad that you got at Walmart or Kroger or something, and they would just be churning the stuff out.
who is that?
Was that John Anderson? Maybe was that his name? Maybe.
See, there's so much, and this is where our viewers don't be intimidated by this because you say, "I don't know anything about this. I'm not gonna comment. I'm not gonna reach out. I don't know everything. I can name drop a bunch of artists,
Yeah.
probably more than a lot of people, but then I meet somebody like Brian, and he can name drop 100 more than I can, and you're always gonna run into that.
It's more
So
trouble recently, but go ahead.
I know, right? So, in this kind of field, how do you learn it? You just gotta jump in and learn it. You gotta jump in, get your feet wet.
Yeah,
Be
you've said it's I mean, my whole thing, I have over the years occasionally had people say, "Well, we wanna start an art collection. What should we do?" And they get frustrated because I always say, "Look at a lot of art."
Yeah.
Before you buy anything, before just look and look and look and find out what you like and go to shows, look on the internet, read books, read magazines, and eventually you get a real feel for it. I mean, it's connoisseurship, which I know there's some people who think that's a dirty word, but it's how you build a collection. It's how you
Right.
become a collector, and it's important to buy art that I mean, I always say don't buy anything that you don't mind having to keep at the price you paid for it.
Right.
And I'm not gonna lie and say I never bought something with the idea that I was gonna flip it, but you can't count on that. I mean, you have to be pretty tied in at the
Right.
there's people who make their livings buying and selling art, and they're called art dealers,
Right.
so I think that it has to be something more than just I wanna buy something that's gonna be worth a lot more money. It has to be, the joy comes from acquiring things that you really, really love and are interested in
Right.
and mean something to you, and that requires looking at a lot of stuff.
Right. And that brings me to something because the last podcast we did, I don't know if we're gonna cut this or you're gonna see it, but I made a comment and I said, "You gotta be an idiot to just purely buy what you like." What I meant by that, okay, because I've been ever since I said that on the microphone, and I don't think that's dropped yet, but ever since I've said that on the microphone, I've had my head I need to go back and redirect that statement because you hit the nail on the head. The very first thing you said was, "Go look at a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
art. Get an understanding for what's good, what's better, what's great, and then buy what you like.
yeah, yeah,
Don't aimlessly buy what you like." That's what I should have said. Anybody who aimlessly buys what they like in the art is an idiot because you don't want to pay $500 for a drawing on paper that is literally gonna be $5 once you walk in that gallery, but if you understand, okay, Richard Burnside has, 300 sales records, and they bring anywhere from 500 to 3,000. Benny Carter, same thing. Howard Finster has 17,000 sales records. When you get a list of, like, 20 artists,
yeah.
then you can say, "Well, I'm not really attracted to Howard Finster, but I love the New York City taxi cabs, so that's what I'm gonna go after." And that's more of what yes, 100% buy what you like, buy what you don't mind looking at every day for 20 years based on you doing a little research on what is and what isn't
Yeah, I
in
mean,
this industry.
it's that thing where when I first started buying stuff, I could buy what I like because, I mean, the first time we went to see James Harold Jennings, I'll never forget it. He had this weather vane that had a cat on it. It was really cool, and I said, "How much do you want for this?" And he said, $10, and I went in shock, $10? And he said, really quickly, he looked really cowed, and he said, "I can let you have it for 5." And I said, "That wasn't what I
That
was
is
doing." You know,
Fun is good, my brother.
"That's fine." I said, "In fact, you ought to be charging more than $10 for
Yeah.
this."
Right.
But if you're gonna start building a collection, and investing, that's when it's really important to say, "Okay, do all of your homework,
Right.
look at this stuff, find out what's what."
And to be honest, it's easier than you think because
Oh, yeah.
there's so many books. So we mentioned the book Baking in the Sun. Go find that book if you can. Anything in that book is worthy of you having in your house. Okay, but that's probably like
Oh, yeah.
upper end.
Oh,
Um, there's hundreds of books out there. Anything that is in a book that's titled Outsider Art, Self-Taught Art, Visionary Art, if you see it in the book, it's probably worth you owning it. And look, I'm doing the Benny Carter book. We're at the end of it, right? I mean, this is about to go to print, blah, blah, blah. Um, you can buy Benny Carter still for $80,
oh, yeah, yeah.
$100. So just because it's in a book does not mean that it's super expensive. But if it's so people come into my house all the time. Do you decorate with this art?
I don't
Is you
know if you could call it decoration, but it's all over my house.
okay, so you decorate with it.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed if you go into somebody who decorates with, like, classical art, like 1870s, it'll be an entire wall, and it'll be one piece of art. But when you do folk art and
Oh, yeah,
self-taught
it's
art, it is no space left. It is like 40 paintings on one wall. If there is this much between the last painting and the ceiling, they're gonna find a 4-inch by 8-foot piece
oh,
of
yeah,
art to
yeah, yeah,
fill that
yeah.
space. Is that crazy? And I do it too. And every house that we went in as an auction company is the same way. I mean, floor to ceiling
Yeah,
art.
and I like that, and that's how I will say I've been in any number of houses where there is, a single Finster or a single Sam Doyle or
Right.
and it works fine. But, yeah, there's a tendency where you want it to be all over, and the thing is, if you look at how they used to display art, in the 19th century and previous, like, if you go to I think it's still there, I think they still have this room. If you go to the Renwick in DC, they have a room upstairs where they have the artwork displayed the way it would have been displayed in the 19th century, and it's the same thing. It's all over. I mean, there must be
Right.
40
Oh,
paintings on
that's
the wall,
okay, which bring
you know?
okay, so my wife grew up in Oregon, and her father was a dentist. They had a nice size house, they had a stairway, and she said, "I always remember going to visit my grandparents because when you walk up the stairway, it was painting, painting,
Yeah, yeah,
painting, painting, painting all the way up the stairway." And so, yeah, that's exactly what you're saying. They used to do that, so
yeah.
now it's coming back with the self-taught. I never see it like if you go to Bill Ivy's house, he's got an amazing collection of Americana, 1820 furniture from North Carolina. But his wall space is that classical decoration of like one painting and there's like 6 feet on
Mhm,
all directions,
mhm.
just blank space. And it does it. It looks great, but it's definitely not the self-taught visionary art way of decorating.
Yeah, and I think when you visited these artists, that's how they had it displayed.
Right.
I mean, they didn't have a showroom where,
So
they
there's
had
like boom,
one
boom, boom,
piece on the wall.
overlapping, like one piece overlapping the other one.
And the other thing is that there is a sense of compulsion with a lot of these artists. A lot of these artists weren't people who were sitting down one day and said, "I think I'll build a career as an artist."
Right.
They were people usually who, after some kind of major shift or tragedy in their life, felt a need to make art and felt, I mean, in many cases, a compulsion to make art. And that's why so many of them made thousands of pieces. And and so when you start displaying it, in my case anyways, I like to have some sort of sense of that, that this was someone who was making piece after piece after piece after
Compulsive.
piece after piece.
Yeah. It's a great thing. I like to tell people, so we started talking about this because I have a collection that's displayed, and when friends come in and they walk around, they'll start to ask questions, and I love okay, one of the things that gets people's attention is this it's like a 8-foot painting, and it's, Charlie Lucas, and it's really weird. It's just abstract, and it's got, like, a metal hand that comes out. So what I do to qualify that, to qualify this is art within 5 feet is Souls Grown Deep.
Yeah,
And I have a little string and I flip. I said, here he is, Charlie Lucas, the Tin Man.
yeah.
And they'll start thumbing through pages and be like, oh, now I get it. Because elsewise, if you're not exposed to this art, if you're not exposed, let me say this, it's not the art, it's the story of the artist. And when you're in it, so like I don't know Charlie Lucas. I've never met him, right? But I fell in love with Benny Carter because of the story.
Yeah.
I fell in love with Ab because he lived here for a year and a half. And, I got all those stories. Richard Burnside through Ron. I mean, I remember a guy telling me when Richard was alive, you like Benny Carter, you need to pay attention to this guy. And I'm like, who is that? Oh, that's Richard Burnside. Never thought anything of it. Then years later, it's like, oh, Richard Burnside.
Yeah.
So, but once you get through that, then you realize, oh, that's Charlie Lucas. I do like that. So you don't necessarily have to know the artist to appreciate the art, but it really helps.
Oh, yeah, it adds a whole level of context and meaning to it.
Yeah, like
and I think that's true of a lot of art. I don't think that's necessarily just true of self-taught or outsider art. But I think the stories tend to be more varied and tend to be more interesting. I mean, it's not, well, they drew really well in high school, so they went to art school and they got their MFA and
well, the thing is, and this is what I tell people who ask me, how do I start this? How do I get into this? One of the best things about self-taught art is 9 times out of 10, you can find a video of that artist on YouTube. Don't search them on Google. You want to fall in love with Jimmy Lee Sudduth? You go to YouTube and type it in and watch the 3-minute video of him playing the harmonica. I don't know who did this video. It is so good though. He's playing the harmonica, talking about a polecat, and behind him is just 50 pieces of his art.
Yeah.
And then it shows him finger painting, and he walks up to it, so whenever we get a Jimmy Lee Sudduth in the gallery, we're like, easy with that. Don't stack anything on her. It's got mud. It'll fall off. And in this video, he goes, look at this. This is mud. It ain't never going to come off. This mud, you can scratch it. It ain't never going to come off. And so when I saw that video the other day for the first time, and I'm talking about I've handled, 100 Jimmy Lee Sudduths, I see this video, and for the first time, I fall in love with Jimmy Lee Sudduth.
Jimmy Lee Sudduth was wonderful. I mean,
and you probably met him in person.
Yeah. I mean, he was far away, but I think I saw him about 6 times. I think I went down there 6 times and always spent at least an afternoon with him. And he was just a really sweet man. I mean, and would work while he was talking to you. And it always helped with him if you had an attractive woman with you.
Yeah. I've heard that
help.
about,
and if you ordered a painting, like when you went down to pick it up, it was phenomenal. It was a cut above.
wow.
But he was a great guy, and he would, and yeah, he'd play his harmonica. He would, he always had a dog name. All the dogs were named Toto, and they were all these little dogs.
Right.
And he's
That's
just
what he
white
painted.
dog. Yeah. I have a great one of those, but he was real. It's hard sometimes. You don't have some complicated story, about them explaining their theory to you.
Right.
It's just there was this aura around him that was just extremely positive, and so I would go down and visit him. And you could just go down and sit with them while they made art. I mean, I used to always go down and sit with Mose Tolliver, and he would paint. You want a couple of paintings, and you could sit with him and just talk, and he would paint the paintings while he talked to you.
Did he finger paint too?
He generally used a whole series of brushes and sticks and things that he had in cans and things around him. He was usually sitting on the edge of his bed because, he had real severe back injury.
something fell on
I think it was marble. I think it was a shipment of marble.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
And so that brings me to my point. It's not the finger paint on plywood. It's the story of Mose Tolliver. Well, he got severely injured at work, and this kept him alive.
Yeah.
Him being able to paint was how he stayed alive. It really did keep him alive.
Absolutely. I mean, the story is
He had a
that
purpose.
that he was just at home, wasting away, and his wife just sort of, pushed him out on the front porch and said, "Find something to do." And there were boards there and house paint there, and he just started painting these pictures and painted thousands of them.
When I go see Marvin Bailey, I'm like, if he's got 50 pieces, I'm going to buy 50 pieces. If he's got, I'm buying whatever he's got, because I don't know when I'm getting back down here, this and that. When you went to see Jimmy Lee, what was your thought process? Was it like, okay, I'm going to pick up one or two? Did he only have one or two? Did he have 50 for you to choose from, and you could have? Or how did that go?
In the case of Jimmy Lee, what I would generally do, I mean, first of all, I didn't, I was building my own collection. And what I would usually try to do early on is I would try to buy 5 or 6 pieces with the idea that I would sell 4 of them so that I could keep 2 of them.
Right.
With Jimmy Lee, usually when you went down there, he had a pretty good selection of things. He would usually have at least 10 paintings.
Okay.
Because he painted every day.
So not 50.
Well, that's what but what I found after the first time I went, I would try to go down and visit him about 2 or 3 weeks before the Kentuck Festival, because he was building up inventory to take there.
Okay.
And so you were pretty much guaranteed that there would be 50 paintings there.
Right.
Good
idea.
But that was always one of the, because this is pre-internet. This is, so there was always that risk of, well, am I going to drive 6 hours and get there and there's not going to be anything there,
Right.
Wow.
But never thought of that.
Yeah. So you would also try to find, like, that was the great thing about knowing people who'd visited before was, okay, well, if I go down and see Jimmy Lee, I'm also going to see, Fred Webster, and I'm also going to see B.F. Perkins. Now, both of them passed away pretty early in my collecting career, but there were always other artists that you could usually set it up so that you could visit 4 or 5 people on a road trip.
Isn't it crazy to think of that right now there's somebody out there that we could go see this weekend? And you may or may not know him. Like, there was this guy that brought in some paintings, and he said, I want you to try to sell it. What do you think about it? And I kind of like them, and they're in this upcoming auction, but it hasn't really dawned on me to be like, I want to buy 15 of these and have them in the back, and
I need a truckload.
And in 20. But I mean, he might be it. And here we are just sitting here not doing anything about it. I mean, there's people out there that are like that are creating right now.
Oh, absolutely.
And we just don't know how big it's about to be. And that's how it was back in the 90s. I mean,
I have to admit there's a core group of people that I'm interested in who are sort of a special place, I think, because they're all people who were born really before or right around the time of World War II. And so they were born into an America that was still very regionalized and very, sort of specific. If you grew up in Somerville, Georgia, you had a very different life than someone in Chicago or someone in Portland or
Right.
and then across the courses of their lives, there was this huge communication explosion, and television became ubiquitous, and you had the development of this kind of mass culture. And so they had one foot in, like, this very regionalized, almost isolated upbringing, and then this, explosion, cable television. I mean, Howard had one foot in, you know, Pentecostal church in, Valley Head, Alabama, and one foot in professional wrestling in the space program.
Wow.
And it's sort of reflected in their work.
Right.
But yeah, there's always new people. There's always someone out there, and there's this real joy. I don't like to call it the chase, but you can. I mean, in just
Oh,
trying to find things. And I have to admit that on some level, the internet has knocked that back a little bit
yeah.
because
It spoils it.
yeah,
It's not new because you just saw 10 pictures of it, and
yeah.
you can see Mary Proctor sitting in her environment with 200 paintings instead of discovering it for the first time with your own eyes.
And there's great stuff about it too. I mean, it is
Right.
but yeah, there's a certain amount of loss there too
Yeah.
that's not there anymore.
No, you're right. Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. That's the same way with picking. When we would go out and, the guy would say, I don't have anything, but here's this lighter. It's broken. You can have it. And it was a man holding a waiter holding a tray. And when you press the button, the light came out of it.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know what this is, but I'll give you $10 for it. I mean, now you could Google image. Well, it brought $800 the next day at the auction. And then that guy sold it on eBay for $1,600. What a letdown. If I would have known that on the 5-hour ride back. I mean, that was such a surprise.
Yeah.
When boom, it brings $800. We're like, whoa, we didn't know what that was. That's pretty cool. So there is a sense of loss to that experience.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing. Like you said, it's a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah. There's always.
You just got to take it for what it is. All right. Well, Brian, it has been a pleasure having you on. I'm not going to lie. He intimidates me a little bit. His breadth of knowledge, your knowledge and knowing that you gotta, for you guys out there that are new to this, you're not going to understand what I'm saying, but I'm deeply embedded into this, but there's so much that I need to know.
Oh yeah. And that's
yesterday,
true of me too.
like-
I mean, you constantly find both much older stuff you were unaware of and newer stuff that you're unaware of.
Like, I mean, like yesterday, last week, I need to know more information, and to sit beside somebody who has the information you have, it is intimidating. So I do relate with anybody who's like intimidated by this field just coming into it. But Brian, it's been a pleasure having you. Man, I'm really glad you came.
Thank
because
you. This is great.
It was like only a 1 week notice. It was like, dude, we want to have you on the podcast. You'd be great. And then boom, here we are a week later. So really appreciate it. I hope you had a good time.
Anytime. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, man. Thank you.